Agree to. I call the honourable member Andrew Little.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to talk on this, the Royal Succession Bill, and note that of the three things that the bill does, one of those is a validation, an act of validation. And I have to say, Mr Speaker, it is a pleasure to be able to speak on a bill that validates past actions without upsetting the good citizens of Mangawhai and indeed of Tasman District. But, Mr Speaker, that's kind of where actually the positive aspects of this bill stop and start. We are dealing in this bill with an anachronism. And every citizen in this country who have their radios and televisions tuned to Parliament this afternoon will be wondering why it is that we are taking the very expensive time of this House and the people who work here on this piece of legislation about the Queen or the Crown or the Sovereign of England. And they would be wondering, Mr Speaker, why it is that in this day and age we find ourselves in this little corner of the world, a nation that is reputed, and indeed this government trades off it, as indeed the last one did, a country that boxes above its weight, punches above its weight, that does extraordinary things, all in its own name, with its own identity, with its own culture, that we find ourselves on this wintry afternoon legislating for gender neutrality in the succession of the sovereign. Now, how on earth does that absurd situation arise? I might hasten to add, Mr Speaker, we will support this bill. We don't want to cause offence to the sovereign because there are bigger issues at play when it comes to this nation's relationship with soft on the causes of royalty as well. Now, there are bigger issues that come to play when it comes to the relationship between the country, the nation-state of New Zealand and the Queen of England. Sir, who would have thought in this day and age we find ourselves legislating, there's the monarchist, the resident monarchist of the House, has to chip in, takes great offence, because here we are having to legislate against primogeniture, and who would have thought in the 21st century we'd be having to pass legislation about that? Who would have thought in the 21st century we would have to pass legislation to overcome prejudice against Catholics? Oh, now, Mr O'Connor is very silent on that point. Very silent on that point. Mr O'Connor needs to be reminded that without this legislation he would have absolutely no chance of getting anywhere near succession to the throne or any part of it. And that once upon a time he would have been deprived of public office in the home country. That is how bad it was. You only have to look. You only have to look. You only have to look at the old Bill of Rights 1688, held up as such an important document around the Commonwealth. What a dreadful piece of legislation that was. And here it is. Papists debarred the Crown. That's not the bad thing, actually. That's not the bad thing, because we can overcome that. That's what they said about the Papists, Mr Speaker. Here's what they said about the Papists. And whereas, I quote now, and whereas it has been found by experience that it is inconsistent with the safety and welfare of this Protestant kingdom to be governed by a Papist prince. That's what they thought of the Catholics in that day and age, sir. And here we are, the 21st century, we are having to pass legislation to prevent discrimination against Roman Catholics in the crown that is meant to be of this country. How patently ridiculous. And then the third thing we're doing, Mr Speaker, is we are legislating to validate the marriages, potentially hundreds of marriages that haven't been personally approved by consented to by the Crown. Now, of course, there is still an issue, in my humble opinion, about why the Crown should need or be called upon to approve any adult marriage. What is wrong with the autonomy of the individual and the Queen or King's adult children being able to decide who they marry? That has been the cause of constitutional crises as recently as last century, not so far this century, but it was a cause of constitutional crisis, and poor old Prince Margaret was deprived of her beau, and King Edward had to abdicate because of his favoured spouse. And thank goodness we've got past all that. We've got through the age of the Charleston, and we haven't had the same problem ever since. Sir, these measures will at least give the appearance of modernising the succession arrangements for the royal family. But the reality is there should never have been any, in the modern world at least, any gender or religious discrimination or any discrimination at all. And we should ask the question, why on earth, and Mr Foster Bell will be no doubt called upon to answer it along with Mr Connor, the self-professed monarchists of the National Party, why on earth it is we are being called upon to pass this legislation in this day and age. It highlights, as I said, Mr Speaker, a much bigger issue with New Zealand's relationship with the monarch. And the question is, how relevant is it? How relevant is it that the time of this House should be spent on this legislation for New Zealanders who simply want to go about their business, but they want this Parliament to devote its time and attention to making sure that life in New Zealand is worth living, is bearable, that the distribution of wealth is fair, that job opportunities exist, that people can be cared for and looked after, and ultimately can be happy. The constitutional arrangements that we now live under and thrive under in terms of this Parliament mean that we have to participate in this charade of passing this legislation along with 16 other sovereign nations. Well, I take the advice. She is the Queen of New Zealand, and that is the point. That is the issue. It is because of those constitutional arrangements that we have to participate in the charade. And so we must really now ask the question, is this really 21st century New Zealand? Is it? And I don't want to cause offence to the royal family, never have done. And for that reason, Mr Speaker, as I've said, we will support it. But it is not the New Zealand way that we support the idea of status and privilege as a birthright. That's not the Kiwi way. Never has been. Never will be. And the good people of the United Kingdom who came out here 180 or 170 odd years ago and to become the second peoples of this land, the second set of settlers on this land, they came out here to get away from exactly that cultural aspect. They came here to get away from privilege and status delivered as a birthright. They came here to forge a new way, to pioneer a new country with new values, to pioneer a country built on freedom, built on hard work, built on reward for that hard work and getting ahead under your own steam. That's the New Zealand way, not cuddling up to and seeking succour from those sorts of institutions that are outdated and outmoded, interesting as they may be, producing of good music occasionally as they may be, although not the theme songs that we get from old has-been pop stars like Elton John and others, and Cliff Richard. That's not, of course, that doesn't necessarily go with royalty, but increasingly it does. Well, we're talking about Queens this afternoon, so why not? We're not just talking about the Crown. But the thing is, still, I don't think there's any offence caused there. He caused it himself. But the point is, he keeps on being rolled out in every royal gala performance they have. Can we have, we could have something slightly more modern. But, Mr Speaker, this is the question that young New Zealanders are now asking. And this legislation will give rise to that question in the minds of even more, that we should spend the time of this Parliament priced at, what, $350,000 an hour to debate these important issues. My learned friend Mr Mallard says that the marginal cost is almost nothing. But the truth is, we've been compelled to consider this legislation under urgency, as part of this urgency motion, a piece of legislation that will not touch the ordinary lives of ordinary New Zealanders, or for that matter, any New Zealander, even those living overseas and even those living in the United Kingdom. It will not touch the ordinary lives of ordinary New Zealanders one single bit. But we are corralled into it, we are driven by it, by our constitutional arrangements, and Mr Speaker, if this bill does anything, let it be a clarion call and let it draw attention to the arrangements that we now have and attract a real curiosity about whether this is the way we should go forward. We are a nation state. We are a bold, proud nation state. We hold our heads up proudly around the world. We contribute our people to support our allied nations like the United Kingdom and many others in the Commonwealth and out of it. But we do that in our own name and in our own right. And we should not be drawn into and be required to spend the valuable time of this House on issues like this when there are more compelling issues to be dealing with. And when we have our own history to celebrate. And I would just conclude by saying this week is an important week, of course, in Labour history. It is the centenary of the Second Unity Congress that led to the formation of the the United Federation of Labour and the Social Democratic Party, the precursors to the Labour Party. And that is the history that we should be celebrating. That's the real history that has touched New Zealand's life, the lives of all New Zealanders, and made a difference, not this legislation. So, sir, we will support it. We don't want to cause offence to the Sovereign today, but it is time we reconsidered and moved on and stood on our own 2 feet.
I call the honourable member Scott Simpson.